Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wharf's Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and it's in contrast to I did Bo Cleveland yesterday. Today I'm doing another recording. And yesterday I had snow. Today it's sunshine. It's nice outside. North German weather for you. It's crazy. And we're moving a little further south today from Calgary down into Illinois with my guest. And kind of like last episode, I have known Tim for a few years. We were at a conference together in, I think it was Raleigh, the Shear conference, where he had a couple of people from France that we both commented on. And I was actually, I think before that, I was introduced to his first book, which was Distant Revolutions, 1848 and the Challenges to American Exceptionalism. But Tim Roberts is a full professor, and apologies for that job, but somebody has to do it, chair of the Department of History at Western Illinois University. He is quite traveled with a BA from UVA, MA from Brandeis, PhD or DPhil as they call it, from Oxford. Been to a couple of places in the world, including Turkey and China, as a teacher. And today we are going to talk about his newest book, which he emailed me about. And I was like, when I got the email, like, hey, Tim, you want me to read your book? Well, why don't you come on the podcast for it? And he said yes, and I read his book, and here we are. And the book is After Barbary, Algeria's Role in the French and American Empires, with Cornell University Press. So Tim, first of all, thanks so much for joining me here today and taking some time out of your Friday to talk about your book.
Yeah, you're welcome, Niels. Thanks for having me. Glad to reconnect with you. I still remember our delightful panel back in the day at Raleigh. I'm glad we've been able to stay in connection over the years, following your travels on Facebook and of course your many great publications. You've done a lot to get us to think about the Civil War era in a broader transnational perspective, or transimperial perspective is the term I use. And you've inspired me from a distance. So thanks for that.
Well, I am very glad. And I have to say, your book was always, your work was always inspiring too, kind of thinking about first 1848. But now you're asking us to think about France, especially its Algerian colony, and sort of how France and the United States sort of thought about imperial projects in Algeria in particular. So how did you, like, Algeria is not a place, nor is France a place that American scholars come to first think about when they think about imperial studies. So how did you come to want to do Algeria and France?
Yeah, I think it's not an intuitive topic on many counts. In my work on my DPhil way back in the day, I did come across an obscure, I found the citation, an obscure article by an economic historian named Folk Dovring, who wrote an article about European responses to the Homestead Act. And in it, that was for Distant Revolutions, and I was trying to understand exchanges between liberal people on both sides of the Atlantic in the 1850s. And he made a reference to the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, seeking to adapt the Homestead Act of the U.S. Homestead Act of 1862 to French Algeria. And as we do, we kind of park these nuggets somewhere, and hopefully we can find them again for a future. It didn't really work. It wasn't really important for that book, but I came back to it later, and I just started, scratching around and poking and seeing if there were any other French usages of American policies or ideas for their, what turned out to be what I call imperial project. And it obviously became much bigger. And it became not only about French usages of American imperial ways, but the other way around, and a connection between a contemporaneous usage by American imperial ideologues, policymakers, of French ideas. And so it became this kind of two-way trans-imperial study. Algeria, again, yeah, as you mentioned, Algeria is not the most prominent place that's studied, certainly by people who are interested in American history. Obviously, it has a lot more to do with French history. But it kind of became a kind of experiment in thinking about places in the world where that become contested or kind of laboratory spaces for political imperial projects by others, places where people from outside not only work out imperial ideas, but also places where people resist and demonstrate anti-imperial actions, ideas, agendas that also get exported. So yeah, I think this, as I say, I claim in the book, it's a project whose model I would be really interested to see if others can locate other what I call kind of trans-imperial spaces to think about how at different points in time and different places in the world these spaces become as I say, places for policy experimentation, places for adaptation of policies elsewhere, places where local people learn about connections they have with other people in the world who are beset by, imperial occupants and so forth. Yeah.
And one thing that I kind of wondered about too, because it's hard to do comparative history, and I want to talk about comparative history in a little bit. It's hard in the first place, but you're doing it with an additional language barrier on top of that. And it seems like you are, dare I say, quite eloquent when it comes to language, because you have lived in Turkey, you lived in China for a while. I assume you speak enough French or can at least read enough French that these sources are no obstacle for you at all.
Well, I think thanks for saying that. I think I have enough facility, obviously, to read French sources. I have taken French language classes, and I can tell you, based on the wincing of my instructor, that my French oral ability is not nearly as advanced as my ability to read. As what I call myself a transnational, trans-imperial historian of the United States. I think it's important that we get into archives offshore and be able to look at sources from other places besides those housed in the United States. Possibly because sources on the French side, and I'll say right off the bat my limitations about using Algerian sources. I can't read Arabic. But the fact that sources of the French perspective in French may have something to do with why American-French imperial exchanges are not as prominent in the literature as Anglo-American topics and books. And interesting, though, there's quite a few books on German and American comparative imperial history, but not so much on the French American side. Possibly that has to do with language. I think it may also have something to do with these kind of comparative or not comparative parallel the old hobby horse of exceptionalism. And I found that French historians are right along there with traditional American historians, and kind of either explicitly or implicitly kind of having a methodology that grounds French history in a kind of unique or particular way that doesn't lend itself to comparisons and connections. So that might be also a reason that this book's topic may be something that is a little bit novel in the literature.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's sort of a general American history problem, right? In Europe, you're almost forced to learn two foreign languages, but yes, American academics oftentimes only have to do like a reading knowledge in one, maybe two other languages, but it's so common, like especially for American historians, to just like, if it's not in English, I don't care about this information, and like, how many times do you see diplomatic histories that just has English language source material and that's it? And I think that makes your book really important and essential, because you are exploring that other language side.
Yeah, and for maybe grad students or anybody out there wondering about transnational history, it's not like you have to be fluent in a second or third language to do this kind of history. I'm certainly not. But so, just even a little bit of dabbling can go a long way. I would say I've written an article, not for this project, but on the Hungarian nationalist Lajos Kossuth. And I was able, when I was in Turkey, as you mentioned, I was able to get some Turkish students to help me with some Ottoman sources. Yeah. And we were able to unlock Ottoman government attitudes towards the United States at the time. And that really, it helped me get the article published. It also, again, at least gestures towards this idea that, we need to validate and use the vast sources outside the U.S. and outside the English language for study of the United States. I consider myself an American historian, so I think, having said that, I take the kind of challenge that Tom Bender, has offered to say we need to get offshore and to incorporate foreign language and study of American history. Yeah.
And so, like, you're published in a U.S. in the World series, and you're doing kind of trans-imperial history, but some of what you're doing in the book is also sort of comparative in nature, kind of comparing how U.S. applies what the French learned in Algeria, or like how experiences are similar in nature. So what do you find is sort of the most rewarding aspect of doing this transnational, trans-imperial, global comparative kind of history?
Right. So the book's chapters kind of, and I try to explain this in the introduction, kind of oscillate between kind of what I call, as you say, comparative history. For example, in chapter 3, when I talk about kind of the status of African Americans after the Civil War and Algerians at the beginning of the French Third Republic, when there was this rhetoric by policymakers about citizenship, about treatment as full citizens of the nation, practices don't really reflect that. You have the rise of segregation and at the state level in the U.S., laws that become known as Jim Crow. In France, you get the Indigenous Code, which is which actually becomes kind of French policy until World War II. Yeah, so that's a kind of comparative topic. I think there's a pretty strong comparison I make in the epilogue, if people can get that far in the book, between very recent, the rise of nationalism in the United States and France. But here I look at the Pied Noir, the people who fled Algeria after independence, who have a kind of very conservative element in French politics in recent time, and the rise of kind of nationalism in the Republican Party in the United States. Not so many connections between those groups, but I think it's interesting as a comparison. Other parts of the book are more what I call connective history, and I try to I think this is really what interested me in the project, is how we can find what seem to be these disconnected historical topics, but if we look and we can find the sources, we find these interesting connections of mutual influence. Beginning with the Algerian freedom fighter Abdelkader in the first chapter, and how he lands in American popular opinion as this kind of noble, quote unquote, savage who is a valiant fighter, but who cannot overcome, in the American mindset, the kind of civilizational boundaries of his people to resist French forces there, and it shapes how Americans think about the Indian Wars, so-called, under President Andrew Jackson. The chapter on the Civil War, which you as a Civil War historian may have been particularly interested in, there's a lot of exchange. I make the case for how the famous Lieber Code that the United States government issues during the Civil War is influenced by Americans' knowledge of French-Algerian military doctrine in conquering Algeria. The chapter on that is really focused on the Homestead Act, but it's a broader chapter about connections between especially how the French are trying to figure out ways to make Algeria more of a settler colony. The way they do that is they really get quite excited about the Homestead Act, which they believe has enabled the U.S. government to get settlers to move into the frontier and to make it into an agricultural kind of economically rewarding province of the country. So yeah, I think there's interesting connections as well as comparisons. Transnational or transimperial history is both. I think maybe people are more familiar with comparisons, but I think there's a lot of promise in what we can do when we think about connections across ostensible national and imperial boundaries.
Yeah, but let me put the hat of as a peer reviewer of my last book, and that I did with Duncan Campbell on. And one of the comments that guy made was that, well, how do you know that these connections or these comparisons aren't just pure coincidence?
Right. That is something I think that will show up in every book review of this kind of book by historians who are not sold on this whole transnational project. And this was a criticism of my first book, Distant Revolutions. My last chapter talked about the influence of the fallout from the 1848 revolutions on the American Republican Party and the sectional crisis. And one of the reviewers said this is just this is casual, not causal phenomenon. And in fact, it sunk the project with that press. I had to find somebody else who was a little bit more open to my argument. So you kind of this gets at the real central or a fundamental aspect of historical analysis, is how much evidence can you muster to show a real connection and influence. I always have students who want to say, well, I want to study the influence of the Declaration of Independence on French people, in the coming of the French Revolution. And I say, okay, how are you going to measure and show that influence. Easier said than done. And, so it's you in the chapter, for example, on French usages of the Homestead Act, I think the ability to do digital searches and databases is a boon to this kind of historical analysis, where you're looking for frequency of references, and then you try to do your due diligence on who the author is. In France, are they a prominent writer, analysis, economist who is parking on the possibilities for what happens if the French policymakers embrace some of the ideas and doctrine of U.S. land settlement policy. Of course, when W.E.B. Du Bois or James Baldwin is talking about French Algeria and how that is an analogous situation to American civil rights agenda, that's obviously much more. I think that's a fairly strong evidence for but the argument being it's not a coincidence that they're having this conversation, and that there's at least one way influence, often mutual influence. I don't know. I think it's a great fundamental question that everybody who does this kind of history has to answer.
Yeah.
How do you show that this topic is not simply coincidental history? I don't know. Maybe beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and it's. I guess if you can persuade the publisher that there's more than a coincidence, that's half the hurdle right there.
Yeah.
We always kind of hold our breath to see what the reviewers are going to say.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. Don't get me started. I have to deal with that at some point over the summer again. But I think there's also where you said that sank your first book was a particular press, right? It's once it's your first book, then you don't really have the ability to kind of push back. Whereas if it's your second or third book, and you can be no, this is not this is not just coincidence. You just lazily picked a reviewer here.
Right. And yeah, I think you're really on it, actually. In comments for this project and criticisms of it, I wasn't as willing to budge as much in what I said I wanted to do. So you're right. If you have a little bit of literature already, maybe particularly as this kind of as a historian of U.S. in the world, you have a little bit more credibility to stand pat on some of the arguments you make, and say, look, the evidence substantiates the claim here. I would. Sometimes you have to think about what you mean when you say there's a connection or there's influence. In the chapter on the American Homestead Act's landing in French Algeria, I remember one of the readers said that it's less adoption of American policy than it is adoption of American image. And so they kind of drew a line between making the claim that it was homestead policy versus this kind of little bit more amorphous American, the image of American land policy coming across and being adapted and configured to fit local, French needs. And
that's
in Algeria,
a wording change, so you're in good shape,
right?
there.
And so, yeah, you have to decide, I suppose, if you're going to accept this kind of slightly watered down assertion of a connection, or stick to your guns. But and it again, hopefully, as a scholar of integrity, you're sticking to your sources. You're trying to not go beyond what the sources say. It is interesting. I think one of the adventures of this kind of scholarship is when you read a foreign language source is to sometimes how something translates
Right.
can be quite interesting, and it will have a consequence for the interpretation. So that's really quite a cool kind of aspect, and something that I think is a turn on for this kind of scholarship when you can, when you're challenging yourself to really interpret the source. You're publishing in English, so that you have to report it in English, but how you interpret it and report it is your call, and I think that's quite cool.
No, I remember had to do that for the first book on slavery, and the terminologies that people used in Europe for that. So that, it is a sort of an interesting power you have in the way you transfer that language from one to the other.
Right. Yeah. And then, when the French historians get hold of this book, they may call me on the carpet for how I interpret something. But I don't know. I don't know what we say to that. Write your own book, I suppose.
Well, and I was going to be like, well, as a German, I will say, well, it's France, so let him complain.
It's interesting. You kind of, there are these national stereotypes that we try to get around, but sometimes they show up nonetheless, and
they do. Unfortunately,
it's a little bit grounded in reality. Speaking as an American who has found visceral evidence of confirmation of American stereotype.
Yes, there's definitely that too. But one more thing I want to talk about, so in sort of in general about your book, is that what I also really enjoyed about it was not that you made these stories personal, that there was always some individuals that drove your narrative, and it wasn't just like in the abstract. It was people that you. Was there any kind of process behind the selection, that this was just the sources you had available, or was this sort of like intentional? Like I remember you had Cavignon and you had Andrew Jackson in places. Like, was there sort of like this was just who was available, or was it that you kind of were like, ooh, I really like this person, I want to integrate some?
It's interesting that you pick up on that. In I think just the way I think about and like history is I like learning about people, ordinary people, and how they respond to, big events, and they have their own interpretations of them. A previous book was an edited book of Civil War letters that a couple from rural Illinois exchanged after the guy signed up for the Union Army. And they're talking, they have a right to talk, and they have their opinions about the war and about democracy and freedom and slavery, no less than the great, the so-called great people do. So I think, I look back over the table of contents, and I think that each chapter has these kind of vignettes about individuals on both sides, among not just but three sides, in France, Algeria, and the United States, who I guess I say represent a profile of attitudes about large issues, anti-imperial resistance, the civilizing, when we think about, these are policymakers, Grant, U.S. President Grant in the United States, Vanier, who writes this law in 1878 about Algeria it's supposed to encourage the quote unquote civilization of Algerians. It's a kind of parallel there. I came across this really kind of idiosyncratic writer in France, France in the late 19th century, who he had actually been in California. He had witnessed the United States. He goes back and he lives in Algeria, and he calls for the relocation of African Americans to Algeria to help settle the frontier. And I think it was a real kind of nugget to find in the archives. Not so much, not people really haven't heard about this guy, but I used him to show the spectrum of opinion that was possible in this kind of experimental age after the American Civil War and in this transitional period in French history from the Second Empire to the Third Republic. I really enjoyed learning about this Liberty ship captain, Hugh Mulzac, who is, ferrying war materials and people across the Mediterranean, World War II. And he had fought to captain a ship, overcoming Jim Crow discrimination to be able to, to be deployed as a naval captain. He was qualified. But then he encounters French discrimination against Algerians, and he has this like epiphany. It's like, this reminds me of home. This is absurd. They have German POWs supervising Algerian workers. And so it really crystallizes for this guy who had not had this kind of global perspective until he kind of runs into this stuff by accident. And it enables us to see how ordinary people can grasp these big ideas, no less than statesmen can. So, yeah, I think these kind of ordinary people, like you said, are really quite interesting to learn about. They are enabling us to do kind of social history, even as we do a kind of transnational approach. And, the great promise of the social history turn was to understand experiences of ordinary people. I think good transnational, transimperial history kind of takes what was good about social history that's been practiced for now a half century and putting it into this kind of larger cross-border, locations or agenda. And so I think hopefully that the book, if hopefully the book is a success in that one. Yeah.
I liked it, so I hope. I would say it is.
I hope you're representative.
Yeah, my opinion matters the most anyway, so who cares?
You're the host.
True. But I think one of the other parts that you kind of mentioned in this already is like you have Jackson, you have Bernier, you have individuals from the Pied Noir. You start from like the 1820s and you go until like modern day. And I seem to remember at I think it was a grad student conference in Florida, where a person mentioned that one of the challenges of just comparative history in general is that you have to manage two historiographies, right? You have to manage histories of two countries to understand what's going on. I mean, in your case, you're even more challenged because you have the entirety of U.S. history. You're effectively doing, like, yeah, you didn't do the first 40 years, but whatever. And you have what? You have the Louis Philippe monarchy, you have the Second Republic, you have the Second Empire, you have the Third Republic, Fourth Republic, and you're going even to the Fifth Republic. You have a whole host of things. Did that ever kind of make your head go spinning and you were like, why did I do this to myself to take that long a durée?
Yeah, my former department chair, I remember telling them about this book project and the scope of it, and the reaction was great skepticism that I'm a Civil War historian and I'm writing about post World War II kind of transnational or transimperial history. So this is definitely a bigger book in terms of chronology. I guess the book is not a survey of French American relations. It is episodic. These are topics that I kind of imagined came up with and thought would be not necessarily continuous, but connected through persistent themes of exchange among these three, places of imperial development. So yeah, I am an American historian. I'm much more familiar with American historiography, but to do this, I had to educate myself on French literature to kind of get a catch up on what has been going on with French historians' writings about the French Empire, French Algeria particularly. And then something I really enjoyed learning about was kind of what's going on in scholarship about French memory, and how people contest how the French Empire rose and fell in both France and Algeria. I would say that as I learned more and more of the French secondary sources, I got more excited because I could really see parallels to some of the things that are happening in American historiography.
Yeah.
So, I guess on the surface it seems kind of daunting and possibly insurmountable, but once you just kind of roll up your shirt sleeves and start reading, for me, it just got really exciting. And I liked learning about the topic as I was getting ready to write about it, So, yeah. And again, it's a book that the press published in its U.S. in the World series. It's not a book that is framed in a series on French history. Hopefully, though, historians who are not specialists in American history will find value in it, and including historians of the French Empire and of Algeria. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, are you more excited to see a review in a French history journal from a French historian or from an American historian?
I'm excited to see good reviews in any journal. No,
Very diplomatic.
I'm really curious to see what hopefully will be reviewed in French history journals and to see the reaction. I have, as I thank you and others and who in the book who helped me, and my French contacts and friends have been very excited. They say they're really excited to see the book and they want to get a copy and read it. So hopefully that's indicative.
Yeah.
I did try to. There's a few illustrations in the book, and they're all illustrations of their French sources. I'm trying to lean into the French side of the book, and to emphasize its French history as much as American history. We might say. I'll have to find out from the press if they're going to try to get a French version. I'm not sure if there's a plan for that yet, but hopefully it'll be something that would at some point make an appearance.
Yeah. No, cool. That would be fun. Then.
Yeah.
Well, if you come over for some book talks, maybe we can see if we can meet up.
That would be terrific. Yeah. As I said, I think it's a model for how to do kind of trans-imperial history that doesn't necessarily have to be connected to the United States. I could definitely see. I am curious to see if other kind of books about these, what I call a trans-imperial space, shows up in some of the literature and world history or maybe global history. Not quite the same. Yeah.
So usually I ask this one towards the end, but sort of in the interest of not going too long today, I don't think we'll have time to go through the entire book, but I kind of want to see which of these episodes, which of these sort of individuals maybe, which one was the most interesting or fascinating to kind of engage with? Which one do you feel like was the most, spoke the most and kind of really encapsulated your project the best? Tough one,
So
sorry.
yeah, well, so my training is kind of mid 19th century and Civil War era U.S. So the chapter on what I call the American Civil War as a kind of razzia, which is the term
Mm-hmm.
for people who don't know, that it kind of floats around. It's kind of a broadly understood term actually in this era. It's not just it originates in French practices in Algeria, but it becomes a term for kind of irregular or colonial warfare uh, on both sides of the Atlantic and as well as in North Africa. Uh, I feel like I made a pretty good case that the American Civil War, on the basis of how Union military techniques devolve from kind of more limited or conventional practices into more what we might in the modern era call total war practices, has a lot to do with this kind of proliferation of the possible success of irregular warfare that the French military in Algeria develops.
Mm.
So I think that chapter makes the case more broadly that we need to break down what we consider to be quote unquote internal or civil
Mm-hmm.
wars and colonial wars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think practitioners, certainly in the US and France, as you mentioned, the General Cavaignac, who does what he does in French Algeria to quell the Algerians, and then literally within a few months is doing the same thing in the streets of Paris. The practitioners of this kind of warfare did not see strong boundaries between the two.
Mm-hmm.
That allows me to talk about the Lieber Code in a new way, in kind of American laws of war that are legitimizing practices of war that would have been unthinkable before the Civil War in terms of what American soldiers are allowed to do. And I think we have to acknowledge kind of pretty strong evidence that this is that we need to think about the Lieber Code as this kind of transnational, influenced kind of document. It draws on practices not only within the Civil War, but also what's going on elsewhere. Lieber had known about Algeria, as I found out in my research, because of his prior correspondence with Alexis de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville was we're familiar with him as a proponent of American democracy, but he's also very interested in development of Algeria, as it turns out. And so he was this kind of transnational figure that also helped to make the linkage between American war practices in the Civil War and French Algerian military practices. I think, the epilogue, I think, is a really interesting kind of after the fact account for how there's this legacy of nostalgia and kind of post-imperial reckoning that's going on in the United States and in France. And there is, again, it's strictly comparative history, but anybody who has heard about the American kind of lost cause mythology will find some interesting and perhaps disturbing resonances with French people's conflicts today over memorials to the Algerian War, to treatment of the Harkis, those Algerians who helped France and then had to flee Algeria afterwards. So I think that, anybody who doesn't really want to go back deep into the early American Republic will find that chapter a really good way to connect the past and the present.
I think you had a lot of fun writing that last chapter.
Yeah, I did. It was, anytime you're writing really recent history, you're kind of having to change it a lot for the latest news. But yeah, you have to stop. You have to put the keyboard down at some point.
But you also kind of
Maybe
could
the most
sense like how you were, the way you were talking, the way you kind of could broadly paint was just sort of like you could feel like there was a lot of passion on your part in there.
right. I guess yeah. I'm interested in politics today in the United States and in France, and I try to educate myself about both places, to think about comparisons, and just be able to bear witness to what seems to be like an Atlantic phenomenon of the rise of kind of national, or the resurrection of national politics. And, as historians, we know that these ideas come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And sometimes it comes from places that we hadn't thought about before, and we can expose them. So if we can map the genealogies of these ideas, I think it's a really important public service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that. I mean, it's sort of fitting that this is a podcast about the Civil War period, so that you brought the Civil War chapter into it is sort of fitting. And from your previous work, it sort of makes sense that that's something you're interested in as well. There are a lot of things that kind of fascinated me in that too, and that, like, I mean, you had sort of your prisms that you looked through, and there's things that I have in my prison that I kind of was like, oh, this would have also worked for it. And one of those things when you talked about, and I will have to admit, I knew Cavagna from sort of some of the 48 June Day kind of, right, temporary president there of the Second Republic, and then of course he loses the election badly to Napoleon. I didn't know much about him prior to that with regard to Algeria, but then it sort of reminded me the way he's thinking about these workers on the barricades in Paris, like at Algeria, and that he fought previous, like how you have like with generals in the American West eventually, and I'm thinking there especially of Nelson Miles, that, right, like he fought Confederates, and then he fights Native Americans, and he fights workers in the Haymarket uprising, and he's translating these experiences into each other, so that these rebellious workers are just like Native American war dancers. And it's like it so makes sense when you think of what you wrote, that this is how people operate.
Yeah, it's not really an emphasis in the book, but I kind of gestured towards it as the new technology of steam travel.
Yes,
enables trains and steamboats, enables people to get around regions and across distances they wouldn't have before. So you can shuffle a general from North Africa to France much more quickly than you could before. You can shuffle an American general, as you say, from fighting Confederates to fighting New York draft resistors, and then out west. So they're witnessing in real time these conflicts that on the surface look different, but they transfer techniques of bringing order, because this is what they know about, and they're not thinking about rules of engagement, certainly in the 19th century in the way we think about today. It struck me that, Cavaignac is a real, today we see regimes dotted around the Atlantic world militarizing, police forces and domestic sites of civil disturbance. And, I think Cavaignac is a forerunner, somebody who translates techniques from foreign or colonial situations to domestic circumstances. And I think that's not something to kind of to say is a coincidence. I think there's a lineage there, and there's a history to this that starts with the ability for governments to transfer military personnel between foreign and domestic circumstances more easily than in the past.
Yeah, but it's also, I think, speaks to the kind of looking down on the subaltern individual, right? Whether that is the worker in Paris, the Native American on the Western frontier, or the Arab Berber in North Africa, right? So it's like you're the less civilized, and therefore I have a right to do whatever I want.
Right. Right. I mean, especially in my chapter 6, when I talk about the era of the Algerian War of Independence. I mean, you have what's called the Café Wars in Paris, where
Right.
Algerian nationalists are bringing the war home, and literally. And it's an interesting prospect for Black nationalists, especially the Black Panthers, who try to fit what's going on in France and in other places of anti-colonial resistance to American circumstances. It's an interesting chapter because I think I land in a space where it kind of works, but for Black nationalists who ride the wave of this anti-colonial moment in the 1950s and 60s, when Algeria becomes independent, its usefulness in a kind of anticlimactic way, but not surprisingly, kind of fades. And so at the end of the day, that chapter shows that there are limits to trans-imperial connections that we can draw. And it's kind of in an ironic way, it's when Algeria becomes independent and it has its own nationalist agenda, its own, path towards sovereignty, towards deciding if it's going to be a secular republic, is it going to be Islamic? They have these hard choices to make, and that disrupts and pulls out the connections that had previously existed, and that African Americans, Black nationalists, had been very enthusiastic about.
Yeah, but since you jumped to that chapter, I think it also speaks to the other aspect that you're kind of hinting at with sort of the Black nationalist movement of like, who are Algerians, right? Because are they African or are they something else?
That was you mentioned earlier that this is a book long in chronology, and that's certainly the case in chapter 6. I mean, I basically start in the late 19th century and go from through the 1960s. So it's a lot of ground to cover. It's a lot of galloping, but it enabled me to trace the kind of ephemeral qualities of Algerian identity among African American writers, observers, tourists. And I make the case that Algeria is this kind of liminal. Algerians are a kind of liminal people. Sometimes they're treated as Europeans, kind of southern Mediterranean Europeans. Sometimes they're treated as quote unquote Negroes. Sometimes they're treated as non-Negroid Africans, and it reminds us that racial identity is constructed, and oftentimes it's constructed for political purposes. I think that's the case in this chapter. I think it's interesting that Algerians are fully embraced, not surprisingly, beginning with the War of Independence and then the achievement of independence from France. That's when they seem most like an ally and a kindred people to Black nationalists in the United States. Before this, they're kind of different places on this map of trans-imperial racial solidarity. And I guess the chapter again shows the limits of Americans' imagination to understand other people as like them or not. We're, everybody, not just America. We're always putting people in frames of reference that we understand, and sometimes those frames don't exactly work. But we make we make do with that, with whatever we need
Mm-hmm.
to have them function for us for. And so that's something I think is the case in that chapter.
And it's a bit sad, I would say, right? Because I remember I gave my students an article on Nkrumah and sort of the Algerian connection, because sort of Nkrumah sings in that Pan-African kind of notion of like all of Africa should be liberated, and is just much more willing to embrace violence on some level with this struggle, and kind of a complete break with the metropolis. And then you kind of see this conversation among civil rights leaders of like whether this should be, right, Algeria should be considered African or not, but if it fits our purpose, we will use it. And it kind of takes a little bit away from that solidarity that this anti-segregation protest and the independence struggle kind of are supposed to kind of have,
right,
in their kind of what they want to achieve.
Right. Yeah, and I think I don't know if it's because, beginning of the conversation, you asked me why aren't there more studies of French American history, and this one of the reasons Algeria was obscure often for African Americans, Black nationalists, was that Algeria was considered to be part of France, whereas sub-Saharan Africa was more, Ghana particularly, was a British colony, and so there was this kind of more familiarity perhaps with a British anti-imperial movement than a French anti-imperial movement. There, I mean, obviously, of course, French Algerians are not ethnically, Negro people. They're Arab. They're kind of the Berber people, are lighter skinned people, and so there's obviously some cosmetic reality, differences that are real. But I think that there's this ambiguity. For me, that was the real interesting part of the chapter, is this ambiguity, how this exposes the ambiguity and kind of limits to transnational solidarity, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
That I think I want the reader to be left to ponder that and how that works itself out in other historical situations. Yeah.
Likes that. And the other parts I was kind of like thinking, like sort of the wider applicability, I think, of the books that you really kind of get a sense of is when you talk about sort of the rights of these imperial people. And I'm especially thinking here what like Napoleon III did, and sort of trying to offer pathways to the Algerian people to become, or like the native Algerian people, not the French colonies, right, to become part of the French nation. And in the same way, how the United States kind of deals with its colonial, quote unquote, people after the war with Spain, and how you kind of see that wrangling in the minds of people of like, they're not mainland people, but they're kind of part of us, but we're not really sure what they are.
Right. So the French basically land on this policy that if it's possible for Algerians to become full French citizens if they will renounce, their identity as Muslims, if they will learn French language, and so a few in the grand swoop of French Algeria, there's a few thousand Algerians who become French citizens, but it doesn't really happen. And there's evidence I found that French diplomats in Algeria discourage Algerians from seeking French citizenship. There's two, I guess I would say there's two for lack of a better term, American analogies to this treatment of French Algerians. There's the treatment of African Americans after the Civil War, and then there's treatment of Native people in the Trans-Mississippi West. And then, as you say, a third case, which is the status of especially of the Philippine people after the Treaty of Paris and the U.S. or in the midst of U.S. annexation. I would say in all cases there's this kind of illicit concept of gradual citizenship or limited citizenship among these places. In the case of African Americans and indigenous people in the United States, I think U.S. policy illicitly says that they can eventually become full citizens if they're willing to improve themselves. Of course, this is much more dramatic with Native people, with giving up tribal identity to with the Dawes Act, which is quite an interesting parallel to what the French law of the Varnier Act of 1878 had really discouraged tribal landholding in Algeria and try to set up much more kind of private landholding and development, and as an aspect of Algerian citizenship in France, if they would embrace that. The Philippines and Puerto Rico, as I argue in Chapter 5, is the American answer to how to become basically like a European imperial power in a way. Theodore Roosevelt kind of turns American exceptionalism on its head, I would say, at the turn of the 20th century. And he says that he and others, if the U.S. is going to be a great power, we need to have some overseas possessions. It works quite well in some places with the Spanish-American War. In Cuba is this tidy little war, in the words of John Hay. The Philippines, the wheels come off, right? And this is a terrible, protracted, embarrassing war. And I think as I said, I argue that has a lot to do with why the U.S. government and the U.S. Supreme Court come up with this different category of citizenship or belonging for people in overseas U.S. territories. I think what was interesting in that chapter is that President McKinley, for example, there's evidence that he was aware of the difficulties of France in subduing the Algerians, and he brought that. He, as well as other U.S. commanders, brought that fear into trying to contain the war in the Philippines and the treatment of the Philippine people after it, whenever the war would end. So that, I think that shows an awareness of the history of French Algeria. By 1900, French Algeria had been assimilated. There was no more, warfare really going on in the way it had 50 years earlier. And so I think it attests to Americans' longer familiarity with French Algeria as an analogy, whose outcome became an analogy for American treatment of the Philippines and Puerto Rico as these overseas territories, not colonies, overseas territories of the greater American Republic. Yeah.
Did you kind of because it's a very contemporary subject, right? Of the whole question of who belongs, who is a citizen, the immigration issues we're having in France as well as in the United States, right? So did you anticipate that chapter would be so contemporaneous?
No, it's interesting. I haven't thought about it like that until you mention it. I think that there's a lot that goes into these places that claim to be, liberal republics that also have a history of empires. What really goes into qualifying for citizenship? Um, on the surface, of course, race, language, religion don't matter, but there's these colonial legacies that seem to work their way into current day policy making.
Mm-hmm.
I think the battle over public history and memory of
Mm-hmm.
of empires is certainly part of this contested definition of citizenship: who's in and who's out.
Mm-hmm.
And when Americans battle over taking down or leaving up a Confederate statue, when
Mm-hmm.
French people battle over whether there should be a statue commemorating the Pied Noir, I
Mm-hmm.
think it is. A kind of illicit acknowledgement of this troubling, of this continuing inability to figure out how much we really will embrace our principles
Right.
of Republican citizenship. Or is there a heritage people? In other words,
Mm-hmm.
we have this idea, we have this concept of heritage Americans now. Is there a heritage citizenship that is operating, that shapes
Mm-hmm.
and limits who else can become part of the body politic? Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes those things pop up when you're kind of thinking about the book and kind of just talking about it. And the other part that I kind of, as we were talking, I came to think more about that, right? When we think about the Algerian independence struggle, it's the bombings in Algiers, or I think it calls it Café Wars, and the sort of guerrilla style warfare. But that's the same that you have with the early colonization. It's on some level what Native Americans do, what the Filipinos do. So it seems like one of the key elements of your book, kind of if we think of sort of the entirety of it and the conflicts that it's associated with, is this irregular type of warfare that colonial people use to resist colonizers.
That's interesting. As a book on military history, it does this blurring of the lines between conventional and unconventional warfare shows up in many parts of the book. Of course, it's a reminder that imperialism and colonial conquest is violent and relies on coercion. Assimilation happens through coercion. And though at the same time, as you say, violence is a form of, as we know, of resistance to colonialism, not only on the frontier but also in the metropolis. I guess I would say the U.S. doesn't experience it in a way that the French do. The paroxysm of colonial violence in the metropolis is a product of long-term Algerian migration into France that starts after World War One, or actually during World War One, and would continue kind of episodically since then. The Americans experienced a little bit of it in the 1960s with the American Indian movement, and of course with the Black Panthers. But it's probably Americans have difficulty grasping the what Malcolm X calls the chickens coming home to roost in ways that actually the French people experience much more wholesale. What's interesting is, for me, is that the French and Algerians are able to today have this kind of fairly operating relationship. There hasn't been maybe it took a while, but they have maintained this kind of diplomatic and trade relationship that has overcome some of the this disastrous, brutal history that was characteristic of it late in the era of the French possession of Algeria. I think there isn't Americans are doing their own work, I suppose, with, a kind of analogous way over apologies over, and the great question we have about reparations for slavery, but who to apologize to, who qualifies reparations is something that isn't really an American analog for the French post-imperial situation.
Yeah, but I think it also nicely speaks to sort of right, like, even if the people don't talk to each other, they react the same way, right? Like, as a person in Algeria, if I'm facing the French Foreign Legion, French army, and I have limited resources, they have huge resources available. I fight the same way that Native Americans fight, right? They didn't talk to each other, but it's just sort of an instinctive, I guess, is the word here, instinctive way to kind of like, this is how you resist in a situation of this nature.
Yeah, I think that probably, you asked about coincidences, and I think that
sorry,
that is probably, and it's actually it is a coincidence, because you said you had Bo Cleland on your show, and he and I were just on a panel at a conference lately. We were talking about kind of trans-imperial history, and I made the comment there that I think one of the things my book doesn't really flesh out is the ability of anti-colonial, anti-imperial people and their ability to forge connections and do this kind of transnational or trans-imperial exchanges of military technique, of civil disobedience, of terrorism. Is it the case that it's instinctively they do these acts, and they, in hindsight, they bear some similarity to one another, or are there kinds of evidence that we could at some point uncover that show that there is connection somehow? They're learning from one another. There are perhaps people traveling across boundaries who are sharing information. I think that that's a book still to be written, to really flesh out the extent to which people who don't have access to power or institutional power nonetheless forge solidarities across political boundaries, especially in an age, before the internet, before the great proliferation of instant information. How do these exchanges? Do these transfers exist? How do they transfer? And so forth are really interesting questions that still probably could be written about.
Well, and like, kind of following up on that, like, one of the keys that we have to think about is, like, yes, right, in the 19th century, it might have taken 2, 3, 4 weeks for news from Algeria to reach New York, but that's still it reaches. It gets there, right? And like, even the local newspaper in Western Illinois will cover something about the Algerian conflict, even if it's just like 5 lines that people then read about. So it's the exchange of information, the exchange of knowledge is just so phenomenal during like most of the periods you are like having in the early parts of the book. So people know, and I think that's sort of key to understand, like, why do Lieber and Begot come up with similar legal codes, because they know about this world that and what is going on.
Yeah, I think it's my dissertation advisor, Daniel Walker Howe, wrote an important book, What Hath God Wrought? And his main argument in the book was the importance
Great book, by the way.
Yeah, I have a couple of copies. He passed away recently, so I'm really sad about that. And but he was an enormous influence on me. And this book emphasized the role of technology and communication, the proliferation of new communication ways in the early American Republic. And I think that is operating in the beginning of my book. As you said, the first couple of chapters takes the story up through the Civil War era, and it's surprising how much information from distant parts of the world is showing up in local newspapers. Of course, the telegraph has a lot to do with that. But beyond that, the steamship and the ability to take stories from one paper and clip and paste, maybe with a little bit of a local op-ed. Yeah. But Americans are reading about. They're familiar with Bugeaud, in the Peoria Herald Whig, are learning about developments in French Algeria, and there's comments and there's connections that readers are making between in certain newspapers about how Algeria might give American policymakers pause before they invade Mexico, or how to treat with the Seminole Indians in Florida when the wheels are coming off of this allegedly superior American military force, and it's not going well, right? Yeah. The glorious, the heroic outcome of the War of Independence and the War of 1812. They have nothing to do with why can't we make it work with these tawdry, quote unquote savages. So Algeria is almost like we might think it's like a different planet, but it shapes discourse about local wars of consolidation and conquest. And it has meaning. It's not simply, I think I make the case, it's not simply interesting things to read. They're trying to understand what's going on elsewhere and apply them to actions that Americans may or may not take. And again, for the 19th century, it is quite interesting that these kind of information circulates across long distances.
And since you mentioned the Seminole War, I mean, one thing I have to say too is that your book is impressive in that you're not dealing necessarily here. You have some big episodes that, right, Sherman's March, or the kind of Philippine insurrection, but you have episodes in there that are not that well known, like the Seminole War or the Insular Case. That it's something where you need to dig for this sort of information.
Yeah, who knows about the Second Seminole War? There was more than one,
right.
But the Second Seminole War was a terrible war for the people who experienced it on both sides of the conflict. It was this war of atrocity committed by both sides. It was a drain on the American treasury. It was arguably the worst, the least successful American war waged on Native people. Some Seminole. There's a Seminole tribe in Florida today. They very proudly remember successful resistance to U.S. military force. The insular cases, I think maybe we learn about a little bit. If you're doing American constitutional law, but it was fascinating to learn about the kind of international influences on the development of U.S. insular policy. Certainly, I wanted to get us to understand that there's the neighborhood of influence on American policymaking about empire is not just English speaking. Americans are more eclectic in how they think about how to frame this new American empire, how to treat with people who are overseas. We can't have colonies. So what do? Well, we try to make them citizens, but kind of citizens light. You have this language contorted by the U.S. Supreme Court about Justice Marshall had talked about Indians as domestic foreigners. They do the kind of return to that kind of convoluted language and with what to do with Puerto Ricans and the Philippine people with the insular cases. They're an unincorporated territory. There aren't really examples for that in the British system. I make the case it's this French Algeria kind of case that provides Americans with grounding to come out with this with the insular cases decision with some of them that American observers kind of scratch their heads at. They go like, well, where did this come from? Well, this is where it comes from. It's Algeria as this kind of analogy for a place that's got one shoe in the colonial world, in the colonial status, and one shoe in the integrated territory status of France, that provides a fit for how to explain the new U.S. treatment of these places that are, for the first time, overseas U.S. sovereign territory, not connected to North America.
Yeah, and that sort of encapsulates your book really nicely.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I think it's, as I said, each chapter is an episode and is a kind of, it revolves around this theme of exchange for a long period of time between different generations of American, French, and Algerians about, I don't like to use the term using, but Algeria becomes this kind of instrument of ambition and of desire and of kind of either real or analogous homeland that sustains this discourse over a long period of time. And again, this is a kind of approach to this kind of history that could be replicated for other kind of well-chosen situations. So I really look forward to other scholars maybe picking up the thread and seeing what happens when they adopt some of these methodologies to their own interests.
Yeah, I think it would be great material in Spanish or Portuguese imperial efforts that would warrant some exploration. So
right, yeah. So that's your challenge, Neil. That's your new book. Congratulations.
No, I will do Spanish, but I'm not gonna do that one quite yet. maybe eventually. But Tim, I really appreciate you taking the time this morning to chat about your book. It's been really fascinating and kind of going back to thinking about some of those great things that you have in it. So yeah, it's been wonderful and
really delightful to connect with you, Neil. I really appreciate your investment in this, the technology of the podcast and of enabling scholars like me to talk about my book to broad audiences. You do a lot to help the profession to make a connection and hopefully get our scholarship into the hands of history buffs and people who don't find themselves in a history classroom but are interested in the past. So you're really doing a great public service. Yeah, I hope that we can cross paths in person at some point, but it's always fun to stay in touch with you with via the magic of the World Wide Web. Again, I'm an admirer of your scholarship, and it's nice to connect with you about my book. So,
thank you for reaching out. It was fun to read something. I had not expected the scope that you gave me.
That's good. I'm certainly going to let the publisher know about your reaction and the existence of this nice podcast, and hopefully your experience will be that of others who find a way to find this book. And I'd love to get feedback from all comers. all feedback is good feedback, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
critical or otherwise. So this is an
Indeed.
opportunity for me
Yes.
to invite conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right.